If you take a look at a horse today, the first thing you'll probably notice is how horse-like it looks. Which, duh. 4 long legs, a solid set of hooves, a long face topped with a big head, and that iconic mane flowing in the wind. It's such a recognizable animal that even kids can draw one with just a few scribbles. And if you hear someone say, "Oh, this fossil is from a horse," you're probably picturing the exact same silhouette that's been tattooed into our brains from cowboy movies, medieval knights charging into battle, or maybe even the pastel ponies from Saturday morning cartoons. Horses are, in many ways, a cultural constant. They look like what we expect them to look like, and that's the end of the story, right? Well, not really. Because here's the thing. The creature you're imagining when I say horse is actually the end result of a very, very long story. And the plot twists in that story are so strange that if you traveled back in time and actually saw some of the early ancestors of today's horses, you'd probably laugh if someone tried to convince you they belonged to the same family. In fact, you wouldn't even recognize them as horses at all. Instead of massive galloping grazers charging across wide grasslands, you'd find yourself staring at tiny, fox-sized forest critters. They had toes instead of hooves, little rounded bodies instead of muscular frames, and their idea of a meal wasn't a field of grass, but tender leaves, fruit, and soft plants. Yeah, believe it or not, horses used to be small, forest-dwelling browsers with 4 toes on the front feet and 3 on the back. No hooves, no flowing mane, no majestic gallop that shakes the ground. Just little leaf munchers sneaking around in the undergrowth, trying to avoid being someone else's lunch. Imagine calling that thing a horse. It would be like calling a chihuahua a wolf. Technically not wrong, but also not exactly the image that springs to mind when you hear the word. And that's the fascinating part, because if there's one thing evolution loves to do, it's throw curveballs. Over the span of 55 million years, the animals that would eventually become horses went through makeover after makeover. They were redesigned, reshaped, and re-equipped by the changing world around them. As the climate shifted, as forests gave way to grasslands, and as new predators and competitors appeared, the so-called proto-horses had to constantly adapt just to stay alive. Sometimes those adaptations worked brilliantly, and the animals thrived. Other times, they led to evolutionary dead ends. Lineages that once looked promising but fizzled out, leaving no descendants behind. So how did we get from those tiny 4-toed forest nibblers to the towering Clydesdales, sleek racing thoroughbreds, and wild Mustangs that we know today? The answer is that it didn't happen in one leap. It wasn't as if one day a little leaf eater woke up and thought, you know what? I'm going to invent hooves. Instead, it was a long, messy experiment, with nature trying out different body sizes, different diets, and different numbers of toes generation after generation. Evolution doesn't draw up blueprints in advance. It tinkers, improvises, and sometimes gets lucky. And horses are one of the best examples we have of this process in action. Because their fossil record is unusually rich and detailed, scientists can actually trace the transformation almost step by step. We can see how each shift in the environment, the spread of grass, the drying of forests, the cooling of climates, left fingerprints on horse anatomy. Toes gradually fused into hooves. Teeth became taller and tougher to handle gritty grasses. Bodies stretched taller, legs longer, built for speed and endurance instead of hiding in the shade. By the time you reach the present, you're looking at a creature that feels timeless, almost designed for perfection, the horse as we know it. But hidden inside every gallop, every thundering hoofbeat, is the echo of those tiny ancestors. The DNA blueprint carries the marks of every change that came before, from the fragile little browsers of the Eocene to the one-toed grazers of the Pleistocene. So when you look at a horse today, whether it's a wild Mustang racing across the plains, a thoroughbred tearing down a racetrack, or a farm workhorse pulling a plow, you're not just looking at an animal. And if nothing else, that should make you appreciate that evolution doesn't move in a straight line. It meanders, it experiments, and sometimes, after millions of years of trial and error, it stumbles across a formula so successful that we forget it was ever anything else. Horses may look unchanging to us now, but in reality, they're the product of constant change. Let's roll the tape all the way back to the early Eocene epoch, roughly 55 million years ago. This is the chapter where we meet the OG of horse evolution, Eohippus, also known in older textbooks as Hyracotherium. And if you somehow stumbled across one in real life, you'd probably laugh out loud if someone tried to tell you it was a horse, because, spoiler alert, it didn't look like one. Not even a little bit. Imagine a strange mashup between a rabbit, a fox, and maybe a miniature deer, and you're getting closer to the picture. A far cry from the elegant, long-legged grazers that thunder across today's plains. These little guys were tiny. At just 30 to 60 centimeters tall, they were basically the size of a house cat or a small dog. You could have fit one comfortably under your arm like a modern-day beagle. Instead of standing on hooves like their modern descendants, they walked on toes. 4 on the front feet, 3 on the back. Each toe ended in a small, padded tip, making them surprisingly nimble for moving around in their dense, leafy homes. Think less hoofbeats echoing across the prairie, and more soft rustling as they tiptoe through the undergrowth. And speaking of homes, don't picture rolling grasslands just yet. Those didn't exist. This was the early Eocene, a time when the Earth's climate was warm and humid, and much of the northern hemisphere was blanketed in lush, tropical forests. Instead of galloping freely across open fields, Eohippus crept through dense, jungle-like environments, nibbling on soft leaves, berries, and fruit. They were browsers, not grazers. The idea of a horse bent over a field of grass? Yeah, that was still tens of millions of years away. So why call them horses at all? On the surface, Eohippus didn't look horse-like. But when paleontologists dug deeper, literally, they found the evidence hidden in the bones and teeth. The shape of their molars, for instance, shows patterns designed.
And here's a fun fact that always catches people off guard. The family tree that starts with Eohippus doesn't just lead to horses. It also branches out to include rhinos and tapirs. That's right, the giant armored tank-like rhino and the adorable pig-snouted tapir are distant cousins of the horse. Imagine sitting those 3 down at a family reunion. Evolution doesn't care about our sense of consistency. It just runs with whatever works. Despite their small size, Eohippus was well suited to its time. Those multiple toes provided extra stability for navigating soft, marshy forest floors. The small body meant they could dart through thick vegetation and avoid predators. And predators were definitely a concern. Early primates, large flightless birds, and carnivorous mammals all lurked in the shadows. So, while modern horses evolved into sprinters built for outrunning wolves or lions on open ground, Eohippus survived by being quick, quiet, and able to vanish into the greenery at a moment's notice. But evolution never stands still. The lush Eocene forests would not last forever. Over millions of years, climates would shift, forests would thin out, and grasslands would spread. And when the world changes, animals have to change with it. For Eohippus, this meant that its small body, padded toes, and leafy diet would eventually become less of an advantage and more of a limitation. Nature had planted the seed of the horse, but it would take countless generations of trial and error, bigger bodies, fewer toes, tougher teeth, before that seed grew into the animal we recognize today. Still, Eohippus deserves the spotlight. Without it, there would be no mustangs, no zebras, no ponies, no thoroughbreds. Every time you see a horse today, remember that its story began not on windswept plains, but in the dark, humid forests of the early Eocene, where tiny, rabbit-sized proto-horses scurried through the leaves on 7 little toes.
Enter Mesohippus, trotting onto the scene around 37 million years ago during the Oligocene epoch. Compared to Eohippus, Mesohippus looks like the first draft of a real horse. Its body was larger, about the size of a medium dog, say a collie or a cocker spaniel.
Its legs stretched out longer, hinting at a future of sprinting across open terrain rather than tiptoeing through ferns. And here's the kicker: fewer toes. Now we're down to 3 toes on each foot. That's right, Mesohippus had taken a major step, or rather, lost a few steps, toward the iconic hoof. The outer toes were smaller, almost vestigial, while the middle toe was longer, sturdier, and carried most of the weight. It's not quite the single hoof we recognize today, but the blueprint is definitely there. And that raises the question, why lose toes at all? Well, think about it. Running fast on open ground is a lot easier if you're not wobbling around like a kid wearing oversized flip-flops. Each extra toe is essentially an extra hinge, an extra weak spot that can slow you down or waste energy. By concentrating all of its body weight onto one dominant toe, supported by a hard, nail-like covering, the Proto-Horse gained a biomechanical upgrade: faster strides, more efficient energy transfer, and better endurance. You don't have to be a biomechanical engineer to see the advantage. A hoof is basically a turbocharged running shoe, while multiple floppy toes are like running in sandals on gravel. But the changes weren't just in the feet. Mesohippus also had slightly longer necks and larger brains than its predecessors. That's right. Evolution wasn't only tinkering with the hardware, but also upgrading the software. A larger brain likely meant improved sensory processing, better coordination, and sharper awareness, all valuable when predators are lurking on increasingly open terrain. Eyes also began to shift further to the sides of the head, giving Mesohippus a wider field of vision. If you're prey, spotting danger early is half the battle. Diet, too, started to shift.
Of course, nature doesn't do single-file lineages. Mesohippus wasn't the only horse ancestor alive at the time. It was part of a branching bush of evolution, with other related genera experimenting with slightly different builds and diets. Some of these lineages fizzled out, while others passed the baton forward. But Mesohippus is the one that stands out because its body plan laid down many of the traits that would dominate horse evolution for the next 30 million years. So next time you see a horse's hoof pounding the ground, remember, that sleek, single-toed runner's foot started out as a forest critter's awkward hand of toes. Losing digits wasn't a disadvantage. It was a winning bet in a world that was opening up into endless fields, where speed would mean survival. But running wasn't the only big change in the story. Around 20 million years ago, the Earth entered the Miocene epoch, and the stage was set for one of the most dramatic shifts in horse evolution. This was the time when grass exploded across the planet. Before this, horses and most other herbivores were munching on soft leaves, fruits, and shrubs. But now, vast fields of grass began to dominate entire ecosystems, transforming landscapes into open savannas and prairies. And if you were a herbivore trying to survive in this new world, you either adapted to eat grass, or you got left behind. And this is where we meet one of the most important players in the horse family tree, Merychippus. Compared to its ancestors, Merychippus was a game changer. It still had 3 toes on each foot, but the middle toe had become dominant, carrying most of the animal's weight. The side toes were reduced, no longer as functional, and you can almost see evolution slowly erasing them step by step, preparing for the single hoof design that modern horses use today. But the real revolution wasn't in the feet, it was in the mouth. Unlike earlier horses, Merychippus had high-crowned teeth with enamel ridges, essentially the horse version of steel-reinforced molars. And the reason was simple: grass is a nightmare to chew.
At first glance, grass doesn't look particularly menacing. But here's the thing. Merychippus, however, came prepared. Its tall, ridged molars could withstand the constant abrasion, allowing it to graze for hours on end without destroying its teeth. This adaptation opened up an entirely new food source, one that was abundant, widespread, and renewable. Suddenly, Merychippus and its relatives weren't limited to scattered patches of leafy plants. They had the entire grassland buffet at their disposal. And grazing didn't just change teeth, it shaped the entire body plan. With endless fields of grass came the need for endurance. Long treks across open plains, constant movement to find water, and the ability to detect predators from a distance. Merychippus had taller legs, a more elongated skull, and larger body size compared to its ancestors. It was starting to look less like a dog with extra toes and more like the graceful grazers we recognize today. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was a turning point. Paleontologists often call Merychippus the grandfather of modern horses, because almost every horse lineage that came afterward can be traced back to this stage. It represents the moment horses stopped being forest browsers and became true grassland specialists. Of course, not every branch of the horse family tree made it. Some stuck to old diets and environments and eventually went extinct. But the Merychippus-style grazers thrived, spreading widely and giving rise to dozens of new species. They were faster, tougher, and built for the open world that was rapidly taking over Earth's ecosystems. In short, Merychippus is where the horse really started to feel like a horse. 3 toes, but favoring 1. Longer legs built for distance. And teeth tough enough to chew grass for a lifetime. Evolution had equipped them with the tools they needed to survive, and not just survive, but to flourish in the new age of grass. Now, let's fast forward again, this time to about 12 million years ago in the late Miocene. The Earth is continuing its transformation. Grasslands are spreading across continents, forests are shrinking further, and herds of grazing mammals dominate the scene. Into this world trots Pliohippus, and with it comes one of the most important milestones in horse evolution. Because this is the moment when the modern hoof officially makes its grand debut. And that seemingly small change made a world of difference. A single sturdy hoof meant that Pliohippus could pound the ground harder and faster without worrying about fragile side toes snapping or dragging. It turned the horse's leg into a spring-loaded limb, ideal for sprinting across endless plains and outrunning the predators of the Miocene, which included big cats, hyenas, and even the terrifying bear dogs. In short, Pliohippus wasn't just running, it was sprinting into the future. But the hooves weren't the only upgrade. This was also the era when horses got bigger bodies, perfectly suited for long-distance migration. No longer tiny, fox-sized browsers hiding in the shadows, Pliohippus reached sizes comparable to modern ponies and small horses. Its longer limbs and more muscular frame meant it could cover huge distances in search of food and water, an absolute necessity in a world where environments were more open and resources often spread thin. At the same time, their teeth became even more specialized for grazing. Remember how Merychippus had high-crowned molars reinforced for chewing grass? Pliohippus took that adaptation even further. Its enamel ridges were more complex, its crowns taller, and its jaws more powerful, turning it into a near-perfect grass-processing machine. These horses could graze for hours every day, wearing down tough, silica-rich grasses without destroying their teeth. Grass, once a harsh and abrasive food, was now fuel. And here's the fun twist. Horse evolution at this point wasn't a neat, straight path toward the modern horse. It was more like a tangled bush, with dozens of side branches sprouting off. Different genera and species were experimenting with all kinds of variations, some larger, some smaller, some with slightly different diets, and yes, even some that clung stubbornly to extra toes. For millions of years, horse evolution looked more like a chaotic workshop than a tidy family tree. But as time went on, most of those side experiments fizzled out. Climate shifts, competition, and sheer bad luck wiped out many of the alternative horse lineages. In the end, only one branch survived and carried the torch forward, the line that would eventually give rise to the modern genus Equus, which includes today's horses, zebras, and donkeys. Finally, about 4 million years ago, evolution unveiled its most successful design yet, Equus, the genus that today includes every living horse, zebra, and donkey. If earlier horse ancestors seemed like experiments or prototypes, Equus was the polished, production-ready model. Long legs, single hooves, tall crowns on the teeth reinforced with hard enamel, and a body streamlined for both speed and endurance. This was the horse as we know it. Unlike their three-toed predecessors, Equus had fully committed to the one-toed sprinting lifestyle. Each leg was essentially a spring-loaded limb, tipped with a tough hoof that could withstand pounding over rocky ground, dusty plains, and grassy steppes alike. They weren't just fast in bursts, they were built for long-distance travel, able to cover dozens of miles in a day. Combine that with their highly efficient grazing teeth, and you have an animal tailor-made for the expanding grassland ecosystems of the late Pliocene and Pleistocene. And spread they did. Originating in North America, yes, that's the true homeland of horses, Equus thrived and then radiated outward. Fossil evidence shows them galloping across the land bridges that connected continents during the Ice Ages, eventually reaching Asia, Europe, and Africa. In these new environments, they diversified into the forms we recognize today: the striped zebras of the African savanna, the hardy wild asses of arid deserts, and the full-bodied wild horses of Eurasia. Each was a variation on the same successful theme, adjusted to local conditions, but clearly part of the same winning design. But here comes the plot twist. While Equus was conquering the Old World, things took a strange turn back home. Roughly 10,000 years ago, horses went completely extinct in North and South America. One day, they were galloping across the plains alongside mammoths and giant sloths, and the next, gone. Paleontologists debate the exact reasons, but the leading theories point to a deadly combination: rapid climate change at the end of the last ice age, which transformed ecosystems faster than many large animals could handle, and the arrival of human hunters, who added pressure on already struggling populations. This means that by the time Native American cultures flourished, there were no horses left on the continent at all. The image of indigenous peoples on horseback, chasing bison across the Great Plains, is powerful and iconic, but it's only possible because of a historical twist centuries later. The birthplace of horses. It was where they first evolved, where their story began millions of years ago. Yet for thousands of years, there were none here, and when horses finally did return, it wasn't through natural migration or survival. It was because humans brought them back. The modern Mustang is, in a sense, both a reintroduction and a reunion, a reminder that evolution stories don't always move in straight lines. Today, every horse you see, whether it's a workhorse pulling a plow, a zebra galloping away from lions, or a Mustang kicking up dust on the plains, carries that history within its DNA. They are living symbols of survival and adaptation, the final chapter in a saga that started with tiny, fox-sized leaf eaters in the Eocene forests.
The short answer is simple, because evolution is a remix artist. It doesn't design animals from scratch like an engineer with blueprints. It takes what already exists, tweaks it, reshuffles it, and tests it against whatever challenges the environment is throwing out at the time. Horses didn't start out as the tall, elegant grazers we admire today. They started small, with multiple toes, quietly browsing leaves in Eocene forests. But as the world changed, as climates cooled, as forests shrank, as endless fields of grass spread across the globe, horses had to change with it, and change they did. When survival meant speed, evolution stretched their legs. When open plains replaced dense forests, natural selection trimmed their toes into single hooves, perfect for sprinting across hard ground. When grass became the dominant food source, their teeth transformed into tall-crowned, enamel-armored grinders, tough enough to chew through silica-rich stalks day after day.
Piece by piece, generation after generation, the horse's body was rebuilt, reshaped, and retuned to fit the new world it lived in. That's the magic of evolution. It's not about perfection, it's about good enough to survive, until the environment shifts again, forcing another redesign. Every time Earth threw a curveball, the design of horses shifted in response. And after 55 million years of trial and error, natural selection delivered the modern horse, an animal so perfectly adapted to running across open land that it feels almost timeless. We look at a Mustang thundering across the plains or a racehorse flying down a track and think, that's what a horse has always been. But really, it's just the latest draft in a very long, very messy story. And here's what makes it even more remarkable. For every modern horse you see today, there were dozens of evolutionary experiments that didn't make it. Side branches of the horse family tree, species with extra toes, different diets, or slightly different builds, all vanished, leaving only fossils behind. The Equus lineage, the one that gave us horses, zebras, and donkeys, is just one survivor out of many. Evolution in this case wasn't a single straight path. It was a sprawling bush of possibilities, pruned again and again by climate change, predators, and sheer luck. So the next time you see a horse, remember this. You're not just looking at a beautiful animal. You're looking at the survivor of dozens of evolutionary experiments. Somewhere inside that majestic gallop, hidden in the DNA, is the ghost of a tiny proto-horse that once tiptoed through the undergrowth on 4 little toes. That legacy lives on, invisible but real, carried forward every time a hoof strikes the ground. Horses didn't always look like horses. They became horses, through change, through adaptation, through persistence. And their story is one of the best reminders we have that evolution is always in motion. The creatures we think of as eternal icons are really just temporary champions, shaped by yesterday's world and always vulnerable to tomorrow's changes. So admire the horse, not just for what it is now, but for what it had to overcome to get here. It's a living time capsule of survival, carrying 55 million years of history in every stride. Thanks for watching, and until next time.